Okay, with that, I think I will start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the March meeting of the Mississauga Centre Area C. At least it was supposed to be the March meeting when I gave the talk, but unfortunately that did not happen. So what we are doing is starting up our speaker program. We had a potpourri meeting last month. We're going to have a speaker, try to have a speaker meeting every month, and a potpourri every month, and maybe some other meetings as well. For example, we're going to have a welcome to new members next Tuesday, and we'll send out an announcement the next couple of days about that. So that's a meeting for everyone can join if you're relatively new or just you are a member of the society. We're going to, this is a talk that we've been given several times. Betty has been setting it up. We've been presenting it before some meetings. And so this is just an overview of the club. And that'll be next Tuesday. So the way this works is if you're not muted, if you could please mute your session, then we won't see your telephone or your barking dog or what have you during the talk. You do have the ability to type in a chat and something into the chat, and that can be a repository for questions, or you can jot down a question that you would like to ask later on in the talk, but there will be a chance for Q&A afterwards. So since everyone's muted, I can't ask if anyone has any questions, so that's good. After the talk, we'll have some announcements. We'll talk a little bit more about the upcoming meetings, and maybe even have a few comments about this comet that's in the sky. And maybe some of the people who have seen it can talk about it and give some pointers for people who would like to see it. So with, I don't see anyone yelling at me in the chat room right now, so that's good. So I think I'll go ahead and give my talk. This is a talk that I mentioned. I prepared for the March meeting, which was canceled when COVID arrived. But I was asked to give a talk as the first national RASC speaker talk, which I gave April 13th.
I can't get any sound. I'm in a Zoom.
Is that Dave Unger?
Okay, do you mind if, why don't I trade your places?
Why don't you mute everyone, Randy?
Yeah, okay, Dave is muted. So I gave this talk April 13th, and that just happened to be the 50th anniversary of the accident of Apollo 13. And what was very interesting is because it was, we were in the middle of COVID, one of the Apollo 13 astronauts, Fred Hayes, would have been at a big event in Alabama that night. But instead, he was in his home in, I believe he's in Mississippi. So I asked him if he would join us, and he did. And he talked to us for an hour after my talk. So that is on the RASC YouTube link, and in fact I sent the link in the email today, just at the point when he came into the discussion. And so if you want to listen to that at some point after the talk, he was great. He was gracious with his time. He's sharp as a whip. He's in his mid-80s now. But yeah, it was a real treat. I don't have him tonight, unfortunately. But we will. I will give this talk, and we'll see how it works. So let me do that. And do you see the talk? Give me a thumbs up, Alan. Thank you. All right. Let me check my notes here. So this is it's the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. And what I wanted to do was cover the mission, the timeline, some background information about what really happened, why it happened, and then we can go into some discussion afterwards. The mission itself was the third moon landing mission. So I want to talk about before the mission, the crew, the plans for the mission, some of the things that happened before the mission that caused some little bit of stress, the launch itself, and how Apollo 13 actually nearly was over in the first few minutes of flight. The first 2 days, one of the capsule communicators told the crew, "We're bored to tears," and that was rather prophetic. The accident took place 55 hours into the mission, so we'll talk about that, and the reaction, how long, the fact that Mission Control first thought it was a glitch, communications error or problem, and it took them a couple hours to really realize how serious the accident was. It had gone from, oh, we can fix this, to, I wonder if we can fix this so that we can still land on the moon, to, oh, we can't land on the moon, we wonder if we can get the crew back. The fascination about the mission is how thousands of people work together to get the crew home. And we'll talk a little bit about how fortunate the crew, in fact, was that the accident took place when it did. Because if it had taken place even 6 hours earlier, 6 hours later, or even 12 hours later, or whatever, they wouldn't have come home. So it was fortuitous. They had problems with their carbon dioxide on the way home, but they finally made it. And then I want to talk a little bit about Apollo 13 and pop culture. So Apollo 13 launched on the 11th. This is just to give you an idea of the timeline. Launched on a Saturday afternoon, and it was Monday evening around 10 o'clock when they had the oxygen tank explosion. And it took about a couple hours for them, the Mission Control, to determine how serious it was. They powered up the lunar module, aborted the landing, decided to go around the moon. They had to use the lunar module engine to adjust their trajectory and speed up their return. In fact, the way they were going, they would have ended up landing in the Indian Ocean somewhere where there were no recovery forces. So they had to speed their return up several hours so that they would land where everyone was waiting for them in the Pacific. On the Wednesday and Thursday, they had the odd thing to maintain, the systems on board, but essentially it was just at that point they were, just putting in the hours until they landed on Friday, April 17th. And we'll talk about the last 6 hours or so of the flight, which was very hairy. So we'll talk about the pre-mission, the crew, the landing site, what they plan to do on the third landing mission, and the fact that they had a crew change in the last one. So here's the crew. Jim Lovell, who had been a Gemini and Apollo astronaut, so he'd flown, this was his fourth flight. And he had two rookies. Fred Hayes on the right was the lunar module pilot. He was going to walk on the moon with Lovell. And Mattingly was the command module pilot. And you can see that on their crew patch, they didn't have the crew names, but they had the Latin Ex Luna Scientia, which was retrieving science from the moon. And the fact that they had an astrolabe and a sextant there gave the indication that they were serious about doing some science. And again, if everyone could mute their systems, please, we can hear somebody. All right, talk about the crew selection. Normally, a prime crew had a backup crew.
Yeah.
And hey, we need people to mute, please. Okay, I think I found it.
Randy, you'll have to mute them.
Yeah, I think I got them. So a prime crew of 3 had a backup crew. And normally what happened was the backup crew would stay as a team. They would skip 2 missions and end up being the prime crew on the 3rd mission after they had been a backup. So in this case, if you look at Apollo 10, the prime crew was Stafford, Young, and Cernan. The backup crew was Cooper, Isley, and Mitchell. So normally they would have skipped 2 missions and would have been the Apollo 13 crew. And you'll see that the Apollo 11 crew of Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin, their backup crew was not Lovell, Mattingly, and Hayes, but Lovell, Anders, and Hayes. So Lovell and Hayes were already working together, and Anders actually left the program. But normally the Lovell Apollo 11 backup crew would have been the prime crew on Apollo 14. So here is the Apollo 13 crew, that is the Apollo 10 backup crew. Gordon Cooper, who was an original Mercury astronaut, Ed Mitchell, who would have walked on the moon with Cooper if they had to. Again, backup crews were just in case the prime crew had not been able to fly, or if normally if one member was not able to fly, a substitute would have come in. They only had to use a backup crew once when one of the Gemini mission prime crews were killed in a plane crash. But otherwise, backup crews were there, and it made sense to have them, but they generally knew it was very unlikely that they would fly. But they had to prepare and train such that they could get into the rocket on the day of the launch and do the mission. So Mitchell was the LEM pilot backup, and Isley was the command module pilot backup, and Isley had flown on Apollo 7. Meanwhile, this guy, Al Shepard, he was the first American to fly in space, a suborbital flight in 1961. He had been taken off of flight status because he had a problem with the inner ear. And with that, he essentially had been managing the Apollo, the astronaut team, but he'd been taken off flight status. He had an operation in the late 60s to fix this problem. I think it was the Meniere's disease or something like that. Chris would probably know what that is. But anyway, he couldn't even fly airplanes. He had dizzy spells or whatever. But he had an operation, and he was put back on flight status. And the first thing he said was, this was around the time of Apollo 11, he said, give me a mission. And he had that kind of power. And he wanted to go on Apollo 13. And so that was looked at, but NASA management essentially said, no, you're probably not ready to fly. We'll put you on Apollo 14. So because of that, oh, and by the way, I should say that Cooper, by this time, Gordon Cooper was, I'm amazed that he was even put in as a backup commander for Apollo 10 because he had lost interest in flying. He was more interested in race cars. So there was no way he was going to be given Apollo 13 or Apollo 14. And Don Isley, who had flown on Apollo 7, he was going through a kind of a messy divorce. And the last thing, and this is in the late 60s, early 70s, this was a big problem for NASA. And he essentially left the program because he was going through a divorce. So that opened the way for the Lovell Mattingly Hayes crew to fly on Apollo 13 and give Alan Shepard a little bit of time to prepare and train for the flight. So several things happened, and unfortunately, that's how Lovell Mattingly Hayes got the Apollo 13 mission. The backup crew for Apollo 13 was John Young, commander, Charlie Duke, lunar module pilot, and John Swigert. Both Swigert and Duke were rookies. Swigert was a really skilled command module pilot. He had written a lot of the procedures for running the command module, and this will come into part of a major decision just a few days before launch. So the crew was essentially after Apollo 11 landed, then a lot of the stress was off about the landing before the end of the decade. They could take some time. Apollo 12 would launch in November '69, and Apollo 13 was pushed out to the spring of 1970. So the crew would train, and a lot of the training would be with simulators, practicing for the moonwalk, but also the astronauts did a lot of geology training on sites in Arizona, in Iceland, and some of the astronauts even came up to and practiced their geology in Sudbury. So I mentioned the patch from the Moon Science. This was the only other Apollo patch, apart from Apollo 11, which didn't have the crew's name on it. Here are the cast of characters. The command module, service module, is this here, and it was called Odyssey. And this is the spacecraft that the astronauts are in at launch, and it gets them to the moon, puts them into orbit around the moon with this big engine, and brings them home again, and then they land in the same spacecraft in the ocean. The lunar module, which is used to land on the moon, it's essentially carried to the moon in a wait state by the command service module. It's not even turned on. They go in and turn it on during the mission just to check all the systems. But it only has enough power really to support 2 astronauts for a few days on the moon. So this spacecraft is critical for getting the astronauts to the moon. The landing site for Apollo 13 was in the Ocean of Storms, just to the east of Apollo 12. And again, this was a site that was chosen for its geology. The geologists felt that there were some rays or ejecta from Copernicus that would have made some big craters in this area that they could visit, and that those craters would have the leftover ejecta from Copernicus. So they chose this site close to a crater which they called Cone, which was on a rather steep slope. And there was just a lot of interesting things that they thought in this site. And it ended up being a very interesting site with some of the oldest rocks that they brought back from the moon when astronauts ultimately went. The TCDT is a test that they run for every Apollo mission a few weeks before the launch, where the rocket is fueled. The astronauts go through all of the preparations that they would make on launch day. They get suited up. They're taken out to the pad. They sit in the spacecraft up until launch. But the only thing they don't do is launch. So here it is on TCDT Day on March 25th, and the crew goes up to the pad, gets inside, and they talk to the White Room crew, and then they come back down. And there's Fred Hayes afterwards. You know that it's afterwards because his helmet is on. One thing that was rather bizarre was an accident that took place before the astronauts made it out there. Some security guards were actually clearing the pad prior to fueling of the rocket. And if you've ever been out to the launch pad, there are these huge, white, round tanks, one for liquid oxygen, one for liquid hydrogen. And this is what's used. It's essentially railroad tankers. Hundreds of railroad tanker cars are used to fill up these tanks of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. And there was a leak, and or at least not a leak, but 39,000 liters of liquid oxygen had been emptied into a drainage ditch after it was used to pre-cool the lines for loading the rocket. Normally, this the oxygen would just dissipate, but because there was an inversion level, it kept the oxygen close to the ground. And some security guards had driven up when they got out of their cars, and the oxygen ignited the cars. And the cars were burned to a crisp. And fortunately, the security guards were away from the cars when they blew up. But this was just another bizarre thing that, you talk about the story of Apollo 13, a lot of weird things happened. And this was one of them. April 7th, just 4 days before launch, Charlie Duke, the backup astronaut, was exposed to measles from his kids who had been exposed to measles from a neighbor. And Duke had not had measles before, but before they knew he'd been exposed, he had been around the prime crew. And Mattingly was the one prime crew member that had not had measles. And so even back then, the quarantine was such that it wasn't sufficient to prevent this. But this was a problem, and they reached a point where they might have to delay the launch. Because it was the command module pilot, they decided to switch Mattingly, Swigert for Mattingly. And this is something that I've been looking into for quite a while. And I've actually asked both Lovell and Hayes about this. And if you've seen the movie, the movie has its own interpretation of what really happened. But there's several options here. You could wait a month. Again, you can't wait a couple of weeks for Mattingly to have the measles and then go launch. There are certain windows where you have to launch, and Apollo 13 launched on April 11th because by the time it got to the landing site and Lovell and Hayes landed, the sun was at a perfect altitude to give them the best view. It was behind them, it was 7 degrees up. It would have given them the best view of the terrain. If they waited a few days or a few weeks, the phase of the moon would be totally different. You essentially had to wait a month. So why didn't they wait a month? Well, you've got hundreds of people on station ready to support this mission, for one thing. And the other thing is you have, something I learned recently, which is kind of, I'm still working on this, but Hayes told us, and if you can hear this in his interview, which we had on April 13th, essentially on the command service module, there are small rockets that are used to change the attitude of the spacecraft in flight. They're called reaction control system rockets, and there's 16 of them on the command service module and 16 on the lunar module. And they have 100 pounds of thrust each. And they're positioned up, down, left, right, so that they can control the rocket. They are fueled by hypergolic fuel, which is kept at room temperature. But the fuel and the oxidizer, when they're mixed together, you don't need an igniter. They just ignite. And they're very efficient, but they're also very toxic. And what Hayes said was by the time of a few days before launch, the fuel lines had been opened and the fuel had been allowed to reach the reaction control engines. And that's fine for the next week to 10 days of the mission. But the fuel is so toxic, if they had to let the spacecraft sit on the pad for a month, and there are other issues about just letting the spacecraft sit on the pad for another month, but they thought that this would not be possible. It would have damaged the reaction control system to a point where they would have had to roll the thing back and change out the vehicle, the rockets. So not launching on the day that they had planned to launch meant more than a month's delay, and just it would have been really, really bad. This sort of points to an issue with the Apollo program that I'm actually working on now, is that does that mean that for every Saturn V Apollo mission that was launching, that had to launch on the day to get to the landing site that they wanted on the moon, if they had not launched on that day, then that mission would have scrubbed for months and just would have put the whole Apollo program into a mess. I'm still working on that, but that's the reason I get as to why Swigert would have was replaced Mattingly. But I also know that if, say, Hayes or Lovell had been exposed to the measles, well, they were exposed to the measles, but if they had not had the measles before, then they would have delayed the flight, and then we would have seen what really happened. Would they have had to take the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building and change out all these rockets? So it's a fascinating thing, and I've asked a lot of people online, and I haven't got an answer yet. But anyway, the long and short of the story is Mattingly couldn't go because they thought he would get measles by the time they reached the moon. They weren't willing to accept that, so they put Swigert in his place. I'm sure you'll have a million questions at the end about all of that. So there's our alternate crew. They had about 4 days to give Swigert a crash course on the flight, and they really put him in the simulator. They threw everything at him. Lovell basically said, if he doesn't prove out in the simulator, then I'm not flying with him. And Swigert did a great job. And Lovell said, okay, we'll fly. So the plaque that they put on each lunar module, which has the crew's name, they had to quickly make another one, and the crew took it. And that was one of the things they would do during a moonwalk, is they would actually have placed this one over the other one that was already on the landing leg of the lunar module. So the day before the launch, this is the Toronto Star, and you see that the main headline is the Beatles are separated. They've quit. No more Beatles. So that was a big deal. But if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, even by Friday evening, it wasn't until about 9 o'clock that they had a press conference down at the launch site where they actually announced that they were going to go ahead with the mission. Up until that point, NASA had not decided that they would actually fly. So at the last minute, they decided to go ahead. Now, the Apollo 13 being the third moon landing mission, it wasn't the first, which, there's tons of interest in Apollo 11. Everyone was focusing Apollo 11. It's, 24-hour coverage. It was the first. For Apollo 12, the second time. I mean, who was the first? What crew? What two guys flew on Apollo 12? Who knows that, right? Because it wasn't the first. So it flew. It was an interesting mission. It got hit by lightning 30 seconds after that. Anyway, Apollo 13, it was reaching a point where, the journalists were going, ho-hum. And even the public, after 2 or 3 missions, just not interested. So this is the launch of Apollo 13, and I do have a video of it. Let's just take a look at the launch.
First stage, second stage, third stage, and the instrument unit going to internal power. T-minus 37 seconds, and our count continues to go well. We'll be looking for an ignition of those 5 first stage engines at the T-minus 8.9 second mark. We've passed T-minus 30, T-minus 25 seconds, and counting, and Apollo 13 is go. T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds, and counting. 17.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
17, guidance release. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
It's another beauty.
Now, the interesting thing, I mean, we haven't talked about the number 13 yet, but we will. But anyway, NASA was confident, and they had an Apollo 13. The launch time, Houston time, was 1:13 in the afternoon, or 13:13. Coincidence or not, who knows? So that was the first stage, and it fires for just under 3 minutes. And then the second stage takes over. The second stage essentially gives the spacecraft most of the altitude and velocity to get into orbit. The first stage is essentially carrying the second stage, third stage up to a certain height. So this is the Apollo 13 second stage. And it's got 5 engines. And you can see them at the base there, 5 J2 engines. And normally, as the stage burns and thrusts the spacecraft higher and faster, it burns fuel, and the whole rocket becomes lighter, and so it accelerates faster because it still has the same kind of push, but it's a lighter rocket. So it's at a certain point, they shut the center engine down just so that they don't exceed any acceleration or G-forces, and they don't squish the astronauts in their seats too much or whatever. So that normally happens. But in fact, one of the engines had an oscillation to the point that it shut the system, automatically shut it down over 2 minutes early. And you'll hear that in the video that I'm going to play. What that meant is that the second stage had to burn on the 4 remaining engines for an extra 35 seconds. Now, there's only so much fuel that it has, but fortunately they put some extra fuel, a little bit of margin in the stages, such that the second stage had to burn longer, and then the third stage had to burn longer, but the third stage had to be used to get out of Earth orbit and go to the moon. And fortunately, the margin was such that they were able to do that. If the engine had had shut down earlier, then they wouldn't have had enough fuel to go to the moon, and Apollo 13 would have been stuck in Earth orbit for as long as they wanted. I mean, they got a different mission, but they wouldn't have gone to the moon, they just would have come back. So rather fortunate. So the video I'm going to show has a couple of interesting things in it. One, if you remember Apollo 13, the movie, and Ken Mattingly, who didn't go because of the measles scare, is shown watching the launch, standing beside his Corvette, like a half a kilometer away, which of course nobody was that close. But it showed him as being sulking and being in Florida, and whatever. In fact, you'll see Ken Mattingly was in mission control during the launch. He was in mission control during the whole mission, and he was critical. The contributions he made were critical in bringing the crew back. The other thing I want to show in this video is Walter Cronkite. He knew his stuff, and he's talking to Wally Schirra, who was Apollo 7 astronaut, and they're talking about the shutdown of the engine, whatever. And Shiraz saying, well, you know, he's sort of humming and hawing about it. And then Cronkite nails it. He says exactly what the status is about the engine. I've always been really impressed with that guy. So here's the video, which has the shutdown of the center engine, the second stage.
The first stage, 22 miles downrange now. The econ reports about 5 minutes. You're looking perfect over. Roger. Econ reports that the cabin pressure is sealed at 6.1
Good communication. So it's nice, clear.
We're now 250 miles downrange, altitude 81 nautical miles.
That first stage booster is going to plop down the Atlantic about 402.5 miles. I've got it pinpointed exactly downrange here in another 5 minutes. Shipping has been warned to stay out of the way after some of the Apollo 11 parts dropped on a German ship out in the middle of the Atlantic.
And 5 minutes, 30 seconds.
Did you heard that
We look very good on the
S4B is Apollo 12 is in Earth orbit? It's just a little bit. And as a result of whatever Earth orbit, it's a way out. So I don't think it'll drop in just now.
Stand by for S4B to COI capability. S4B to COI, Roger. Roger, you've got it now, Jim. You've got S4B to COI.
Got this one guy that's too happy. Has some camera mission control. That's what you're required. Very important. What he's going to do right now is start training for 16, I'm sure. Training for 16, looking for Chuck Berry.
Jim, Houston, we don't have a story on why the import output's early, but the other engines are go and you're go.
Ooh.
Roger.
Had an early shutdown on England. I'm not sure we started the second stage or not. Actually, the second stage is capable of compensating unless it was a very early. Oh, yes, this did. That's an interesting thing, in fact.
6 minutes, 40 seconds. Still looking good. Your gimbals are good. Trim is good.
The 5 engines of the first stage, of course, are required to complete total mission. But if one of those fails at a certain point in time, the other 4 can maintain enough lift to work as conserve life.
8 + 3 8 nominal. S2 cutoff time 9er + 4 8. Roger, nominal a little bit later, 4 8 on the cutoff. That's affirmative, and stand by for S4B to orbit. Mark, you have S4B to orbit, Jim. Roger, we have S4B to orbit. We still have 4 good engines on the Saturn second stage, showing altitude of 96 nautical miles, 545 downrange.
It's a little over 600 statute miles downrange.
And the 7 minutes 45 seconds booster report. We are go. All 4 engines remaining, looking good.
Great.
The early shutdown of the center engine would cause no problem. It would run a little bit longer than normally scheduled. It's looking good at 8 minutes.
That is the end word of the phase. You know, it just means you burn longer on the remaining 4. The same propellant, of course, is available. So we just run it through 4 engines in lieu of the 5th. The 5th engine has shut down. It's not wasting fuel. If another shut down now, though, they'll make it another bad day. They would go. So the S4B might get in the orbit. It's like not how the 2 left the orbit. You know, S4B capability there.
All right, so they did get into orbit, and they're on their way to the moon. The next morning, as I mentioned, Mission Control woke them up and said the spacecraft is in real good shape, and we're bored to tears down here. So it was nothing was showing up being wrong with the system, and it's just 9 hours until the accident. On Monday evening, they had a TV show where they opened up the lunar module and went inside, and part of the lack of interest in the mission was that the three main networks in the U.S. Did not carry the TV show live, which they make a big deal of that in the Apollo 13 movie.
Okay, Jim, we're seeing a tape recorder now, and just by the way, how long do you expect to keep the TV on, Jim? Well, yeah, I got him with the Kevin Reaper now. Every time he does that, our heart's coming up. Jack, anytime you want to come in. Okay, Jim, been a real good TV show. We think we're going to conclude it from here now. What do you think? Roger, sounds good. And this is the new Apollo 13, which is evening, and probably close out our connection of Aquarius and get back to a pleasant evening and Odyssey.
So that was just the last few minutes of about a 1 hour TV show. So that they stopped the TV show at 55 hours, 46 minutes into the mission. And the accident was at 55 hours, 55. So it was just 9 minutes away from the accident at that point. That one little bit at the beginning where Lovell says, stand by one, there was this valve that, this air valve that Hayes would throw in the lunar module that made this huge bang. And every time he did it, the other two guys went, what the heck was that? And, he said that whenever he does that, our hearts are in our throats. When the accident actually takes place 9 minutes later, the two astronauts look at Hayes again. And he's, like, what did you do? And Hayes went, it wasn't me. So it was it's kind of a neat story. All right, so let's talk about the accident. We'll look at the fuel cells, which provide the power for the system. We'll look at the actual accident, and then how Mission Control figured out the problem, or at least worked on it, and the frustration and denial that was going on in Mission Control for the longest time, and then the decision to have an alternate mission. So this is Mission Control, and everyone is at a specific spot. The main conductor is the flight director, and there are various flight controllers who have certain responsibilities for different aspects of the mission. And it sort of looks like that with the flight director right in the middle, in the third row there. So at the time of the accident, Gene Kranz, who was the lead flight director, was on board. There were three teams. I think there were three teams. And so there would be obviously 24-hour coverage in each team, the gold and the black and the white teams. They would have a flight director, and each of them would have their own flight controllers. The capsule communicator was the one person who talked to the crew, and that would be an astronaut. And the one that we heard during the launch there was Joe Kerwin, and he was on one of the teams. The other two capsule communicators were Jack Lausma and Vance Brand, again, both astronauts. And it's Lausma who was the capsule communicator when the accident took place. Cy Liebergott was one of the flight controllers. He was Econ. They had names like Retro and Fido and all these cool names. So Econ, he was in charge of electrical environmental communications. So when Apollo 13 had its problem, he was under the gun to figure out what was going on. This is a view of the screen that Cy would have to give him information on the status of the variable systems there'd be pressures, there'd be temperatures. He could call up various screens. Obviously not the nicest kind of system that, you know, you look at the mission control now or the space station control room, and everyone has these huge monitors, and they're playing with, you know, they have all got computer mice and stuff like that. But this was the standard back during the Apollo days. So we looked at this before, the command service module having the responsibility of getting the crew to and back from the moon. So it had all of the oxygen, all of the electricity to do that. It's in the service module where you have the fuel cells. And the fuel cells, there were 3 of them. They were used to provide the electrical power. Solar panels weren't efficient enough back then. The next time they go to the moon, they'll have solar panels because they're much more efficient now. But at that point, they had to use fuel cells. And what they did is they took liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and they put them together, and it generated electricity. So these were in the service module. So there's a picture of 2 of the 3 fuel cells. The 3rd one is behind. And this is a fuel cell that was on display in a museum that we saw in Idaho when we were there for the 2017 eclipse. They had this great Apollo display. It was a roving display, and we just happened to see it. And they had this fuel cell there. It's amazing. So that's what one of the fuel cells looked like. And the chemistry is just that. The hydrogen and oxygen go together, and it generates an electrical current. And what comes out of it is water, liquid water, which the astronauts would actually use to drink and heat. So very efficient. They first used this system in the Gemini days, and it was used on all the Apollo, and it was used on the shuttle. I mean, the shuttle flew for up to 16 days, and they just carried extra tanks of hydrogen, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in the payload bay, and it generated the power for it. The oxygen tanks were underneath the fuel cells. There's one of the oxygen tanks there, and then the liquid hydrogen tank below it. The lunar module, on the other hand, they were going to put fuel cells in the lunar module, but they were too heavy. And the lunar module during development had a real problem with being too heavy. So they went to batteries. So the LEM, as I said, has enough electricity, power, just power, water, fuel, whatever the astronauts need to be on the moon for a couple of days, that's what it takes. But that's generally all it takes. So here we are in mission control, and we're going to look. What we're going to do is we're going to listen to some of the communications between Krantz, the flight director, and Cy as the oxygen happens and as it develops. Right after the TV show, they were beginning to get ready to put the crew to bed. It's funny that there's a comet in the sky right now. There was a really interesting comet in the sky back then called Comet Bennett, rather bright apparently. I didn't see it. I went out and tried to see it, but I didn't see it, but I was just getting into astronomy at the time. But the astronauts were going to observe it, and they were telling them they actually have a telescope on the spacecraft for navigation, and they have a shaft and trunnion on it. You can essentially like a right ascension and declination, and Mission Control was telling them what to set them to so they could look through the telescope at the comet and actually take some photos. One of the things that the Econ does is they keep track of the amount of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen for the fuel cells, and because there's free fall, the liquids sort of flow around or whatever. What they do is they use fans in the tank to stir it up to get a better idea of how much is there. So what we'll hear is that kind of a conversation. Cy Lieberdot will ask for the fans to be used to stir, so he can get an idea of how the levels are.
That's like a verification of the docking angle, because that's what we use for compensation alignments and everything else.
let's see if there's anything else. Right? Go ahead, Ecom. Okay, we'll terminate the battery B charge at 55 plus 50. Okay, and at the same time, I'd sure like to have browse their old 4 tank. Let's wait till they get settled down a bit more. Roger.
So there are 2 power systems in the command service module, A and B. And I guess that was just a redundancy. So they're getting power from A, then they're getting power from B, and they're recharging batteries from the fuel cells, just managing their systems. Here's Jack Blausma as capsule communicator, and he's going to be talking to the crew to pass those instructions from Ecom, from the flight director.
Okay, and we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tank. In addition, I have a shaft and trunnion. Okay. Or a look at the Commons Bennett if you need it. Stand by. We've had a problem here. Say again, please. Here's where we've had a problem. Main B bus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Stand by 13, we're looking at it.
Okay, so the undervolt means that one or both of the power systems has less voltage than it expects, I guess. That static that you heard was in fact the accident, and it actually, part of the one side of the service module actually blew away, and it nicked the antenna that was used to communicate with the Earth, and that's why you heard that static. So here's Cy. What we're going to do is hear his audio circuit during the accident, and it's interesting how he immediately says, "Oh, that's just instrumentation or whatever. That's nothing," and quickly will change after that.
ECS Ecom. Go Ecom. You getting your stir now on the O2? Okay. Might be. No, that's data. We've gone off the hygiene.
Checklist anyway on board, don't you? Right. Don't you got a page update? Well, why don't we read it up to them, and that'll serve both purposes. All right. Both have mannered, as well as why don't you tell them what page you want in the checklist. Okay. What, Tony? What's the matter with the data?
We got more than a problem. Okay, listen, you guys. We've lost fuel cell 1 and 2 pressure. We lost O2 tank 2 pressure. And temperature. Okay. Stand by, they got a problem.
Roger, main B undervolt.
Negative flight.
O2 tank 2 pressure?
I believe the crew reported.
We got a main B undervolt.
Okay, flight. We've got some instrumentation flights. Let me add them up. Roger.
Okay, stand by 13. We're looking at it.
Okay, so the flight director's job when there's a problem is to direct the various flight controllers in the right direction and to take information from them and digest it and then suggest a way to go, or to ask the controllers which way you want to go. But he is essentially responsible in moving things forward.
We need to put a fuel cell on bus B. Okay. So a lot of instrumentation problems. Go ahead, Frank.
Hey, he's removed fuel cell 1.
He's flipping our fuel cells around, Frank. Well, let's get some recommendation here, Si. If you got any better ideas.
So Gene is already saying, okay, let's not leave the crew in a lurch. What do you suggest we do?
Okay, now, do we have instrumentation problems? Well, we lost it does appear we've lost AC bus 2 voltage. Main B is reading 4 volts, and that effectively takes AC2 away from us. Okay. Yeah, and he reported barber poles on the fuel cells on the R2 flight. So
the fuel cells are dying, and Cy is going through all the different systems and trying to figure out what's going on. And Krantz, makes one of the quotes that I think is one of the quotes of the mission, which is, all right, let's sort of regroup here. What is working on the spacecraft?
We're showing can we review our status here, Cy, and see what we've got from a standpoint of status? What do you think we got in the spacecraft that's good?
I don't know, I just love that. So here's Cy talking to, and he's got a lot of support in the back room, and they're sort of looking at all the things that are going on, and he's beginning to realize that it's not an instrumentation problem. They're beginning to see that 2 fuel cells have failed, and the chances of 2 fuel cells failing at the same time is impossible. And he says that can't be right. And then he suggests that we blew a sphere, meaning he thinks maybe an oxygen tank is blown.
EPS, can. Yeah. Why don't we just try fuel cell 1 on main B by itself to see if that takes?
We're showing low N2 pressure on fuel cell 1. We're showing low O2 pressure on fuel cell 3. I want to suck out what those fuel cells are doing here. We might have a pressure problem in the fuel cell, it looks like.
Yeah, see the
fuel
engine.
cell simultaneously.
That can't be.
I can't believe that right off the bat. But they're not feeding currents.
Yeah, if you believe that N2 pressure, we blew a sphere.
Now the astronauts look outside the window and they see something venting from the spacecraft.
Why, Jesus.
Jack, our O2 quantity number 2 tank, we can
That's Roger Flight. That's the AC problem. Roger.
Yeah, that's just AC. And it looks to me, looking at the tanks, that we are venting something. Crew thinks they're venting.
Good flight. Flight to Econ.
Go ahead,
Let me know when that shows up.
Roger that. Well, we've already seen some of it.
Okay.
So Cy calls Fido, which is the flight dynamics officer, who would know what attitude the spacecraft is in. And he's saying the venting fuel hasn't changed the attitude of the spacecraft. He says, yeah, we've already noticed that the attitude of the spacecraft has changed. Krantz is at a point now where he's saying, okay, let's go through and figure out what's going on, but don't guess, don't make things worse. And this is, I wrote it out so you could follow along. This is really to the whole team that, things are relatively stable. We have a LEM, which could be used to support the crew, but don't make things worse by guessing.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got LEM still attached. The LEM spacecraft's good, so if we need to get back home, we got a LEM to do a good portion of it with. Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that's going to blow our CSM electrical power with the batteries, or that will cause us to lose the main or the fuel cell number 2. Okay, we want to keep the O2 and that kind of stuff working. We'd like to have RCS, but we got the command module system. So we're in good shape if we need to get home. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
And I think that's interesting because it's just only been 15 minutes since the accident. So this is the point we're at. We're already thinking that we're in big trouble, but it's not the end of the world. So back with Cy now, and Cy is beginning to think that we don't have the power. You have to start powering down systems.
Go ahead. Larry, I'm almost afraid to think that we lost our O2 tank 1. Or we busted the manifold or something. Why, that pressure shouldn't be down that far. Flight, go ahead. I think the best thing we can do right now is start a power down. Okay, let's go down emergency 1-5.
You want to power it down, let us look at the TM and all that good stuff, and then come back up.
That's right.
So everyone's getting a little frustrated now, and Krantz is talking to Cy, and he's basically saying, let's, just make sure we don't blow it.
Go flight.
don't want to get fuel cell pumps off, do you?
We can go ahead and turn them off on one. Which one, Dick? Turn off fuel cell one pumps. Okay. We can do that on fuel cell number one flight. And,
Okay, well, let's make sure we don't blow the whole mission.
So the LEM was, there was always the chance, or the part of the design of Apollo was that they realized that if something happened like this, the LEM would have to be used to get home. And so there was what they called the LEM lifeboat. And Psi is beginning to move that way.
okay. Flight Econ.
Go ahead, Econ.
The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM systems. I'm going to have to power way down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to save the O2 for the third fuel cell, for fuel cell 2 rather.
So Psi is getting really frustrated now, and Krantz keeps asking him for answers. And, you know, you'll hear the frustration in Psi's voice when he says no to Krantz. They are beginning to see the oxygen pressure in the service module go down to a critical level where the fuel cells die. They say they've got 2 hours to go. They've got to have the LEM up and running by then. And things are just beginning to get a little hairy.
Okay.
Flight Econ.
Any more suggestions in trying to pump up O2 tank 1 pressure?
No. Flight, we're going to hit 100 PSI in an hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there.
Okay, 100 PSI.
Less than 2 hours now.
Here in mission control, we're looking now looking towards an alternate mission, swinging around the moon and using the lunar module power systems because of the situation that has developed here this evening. We now show a velocity of 3,210 feet per second. This is Apollo Control Houston.
We have a procedure for getting power from the LEM. We'd like you to copy down.
Okay, stand by, Jack. That sounds like good news. Okay, Jack, about how long is it?
It's not a very long procedure, Fred. We figure we've got about 15 minutes worth of power left in the command module, so we want you to start getting over in the LEM and getting some power on that. And you ready to copy your procedure?
Okay.
Okay, in the CSM.
Stand by.
This is Apollo Control at 57 hours 46 minutes ground elapsed time. The black team of flight controllers is now on station in Mission Control Center looking at possible alternate missions as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak in the cryogenic oxygen in the service module. And now in the process of powering down the command module, less than 15 minutes remaining of technical power to the CSM. The command module surge tank has been charged with oxygen for entry. The scheme of going across to the lunar module, still connected with the open tunnel, the lunar module would serve as a sort of lifeboat for the crew of Apollo 13. Sometime later in the mission, it is expected that they would return to the pre-return trajectory. They left yesterday in the mid-course correction burn number 2. The parasynthion near the moon, they would use the descent propulsion system of the lunar module for trans-earth injection burn at about 79 hours 30 minutes ground elapsed time. This would produce a day early entry at about 142 hours. That is a day earlier than.
Okay, so how to get the crew back? They have limited consumables. They were on a trajectory that would not bring them back to Earth, so they had to fire their lunar module engine to fix that. They would go around the moon and make it back to Earth. They knew where they were in space because they had a navigation system on both spacecraft, actually, but the main one was on the command module. And they used a telescope to sight on stars, and they told the computer where the stars were, and they had a guidance computer, and they had a gyroscope system, and that is how they navigated back and forth. They had to take that information and actually feed it into the lunar module before the command module died. The path that they were on was the dashed path. They were not on what they called a free return trajectory. And that was because it was more efficient to get to the landing site by doing that. So the first thing they had to do was to burn the engine to get them back on what's called a free return trajectory, the solid line, to get them back to Earth. And then they had several burns along the way to adjust their trajectory. So this would have been this would have been a burn of the lunar module's main engine when it was docked to the command service module. The amazing thing about this is they foresaw the possibility of doing this. And in fact, this is an image out of the Apollo 9 press kit. They actually did this on Apollo 9 in Earth orbit. They fired up the lunar module descent engine, docked to the command service module. So they'd already done this, and it was proven. So it came in very handy on this mission.
I'm gone for 1 minute. Roger, Aquarius, you go for the burn. Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good. Oh, shut down. You're looking at 1685 now, Jack. Okay, go on the residuals, proceed. Okay, when you say go on the residuals, you mean don't trim them, is that right? That's affirmative, no trim required.
Okay, so the reason they were using the lunar module engine, of course, is they don't have the power in the command service module to use their big engine. So they're totally dependent on the lunar module. Back then, I was interested in Apollo. I had an Apollo 13. This is what you could actually go and buy a scrapbook with Apollo on the front. And this is my Apollo 13 scrapbook. And the Tuesday morning, there's the Globe and Mail headline that the moon mission was canceled. So obviously the press, which had more or less ignored Apollo 13, was now very interested in what was going on. And this became, whatever was going on in the mission, canceled regular programming. And, you could follow along what was going on because the mission had suddenly got a little bit more interesting. So this is their consumable situation. And it looked like they had enough oxygen. The water was not only for drinking, but it cooled the LEM. And they had enough water. Power was a problem. They would have to power down the lunar module to essentially make the battery power last. But also there was a way that they could send some power to the command module because the command module batteries need to be powered up for the landing. So that was critical as well. But the problem they had was, as I mentioned earlier, they were going to go around the moon, but they had to speed up to get back to the Pacific and not land in the Indian Ocean. So that was another burn, what they called PC +2, parasynthium plus 2 hours. And that was a rather critical and long burn. So this is the view they had going around the moon. They were actually a lot higher above the moon and above the backside of the moon than the astronauts normally were. One thing that was a first on Apollo 13 is that the third stage was targeted to land on the moon, to crash into the moon, because the previous mission, Apollo 12, had put a set of seismometers on the moon. So when this happened, the moon rang like a bell for hours. And the lunar LCROSS, the reconnaissance satellite, actually took a photograph of the crater that the third stage made. So the PC +2 burn was a rather long burn and critical, but it went off okay. The astronauts not only had their navigation system, but they had ways to look through the window using reticles and numbers grids on the window to sight astronomical objects to determine that their attitude was proper for the burn.
Okay.
I think I'll just pass through that burn for the sake of time. Meanwhile, the astronauts were exhaling carbon dioxide, and normally there are systems, lithium hydroxide canisters like this one, that takes the carbon dioxide out of the air. But again, they were in the lunar module, which only had enough lithium hydroxide canisters for 2 men for 2 days. Now they had 3 men for 4 days. So you'd think that they would just use the command module lithium hydroxide canisters because they had a whole bunch of them in there. But unfortunately, the lunar module lithium hydroxide canisters were circular, and the command module lithium hydroxide canisters were square because 2 different companies built the spacecraft and they weren't talking to each other. So they had to come up with a way to build some sort of way to pass the air through one of the square cubic command module lithium hydroxide canisters. And so that took them a few hours, and they do a big thing in the Apollo 13 movie where they essentially throw all this stuff on a table and says, this is the stuff they have in the spacecraft. Now, how do we fix this problem? This is one of the big success stories during the flight. And there you see the crew with the lithium hydroxide canister in the background there. And there is documentation online which shows you exactly how to build one of these things if you're interested. So, meanwhile, they needed another mid-course correction to align their trajectory at 105 hours. And again, they used the Earth and the Sun to align the spacecraft. Inside the lunar module, inside the command module, lunar module, it was dark. The power was off, and it was beginning to get very cold in the spacecraft. It probably got down to about 6 or 7 degrees Celsius. The astronauts slept when they could, but it was really difficult sleep, and they were being Hayes began to complain because they were asking him to do all these things that he hadn't trained for. And an astronaut is happy when he has a checklist in hand and is doing something that he's trained for. And all these different things that he'd never trained for. He actually said at one point, geez, I wish they'd asked me to do something that I knew how to do. But they worked as a team with mission control, and they did what they had to do and when they had to do it. So here's just some 16mm film of the crew inside the lunar module, all 3 of them in there, eating cold food, and well, it's like 3 people in the front seat of a station wagon, essentially. One of the things on the lunar module is a system that is used to pressurize the fuel to move it to the engine when they landed. And the way they did that is they carried a tank of liquid helium. And that liquid helium should have been used by now to pressurize the engine to land on the moon. But it hadn't, because of course they hadn't landed on the moon. But they knew that after about a certain amount of time, the helium in the tank would warm and become a gas, and the tank would normally explode. But it was designed not to explode. It had a relief valve in it. And so they were waiting for that to happen because, of course, when that tank relief valve went, they would no longer be able to use the engine. And they were actually waiting for this to happen. Unfortunately, they got all of the major burns in before that happened. And you can see where the liquid helium tank is on the lunar module, but they actually built it so it's kind of sticking out there. I guess because they didn't have room inside for it. They had a final burn just a few hours before re-entry to get right in the proper corridor, because again, there's a very thin margin for error when you're coming in. And again, they used the moon and the Earth and the Sun to line things up. So the last few hours were very busy. The plan was to first get rid of the service module. and then the crew, and then they could use the lunar module thrusters to move away from the service module. And then they would get in the command module and they would jettison the lunar module. And then they'd come in and re-enter. And here's a little bit more detailed graphic showing what happened. And there's a lot going on. And these guys had lousy sleep and they were cold. Well, the nice thing at a certain point when they powered up the command module, which had never been done before in space, was they could turn the heat on so they could begin to get a little bit of heat. In fact, they could do that a little early because they'd saved so much power. But there was a lot that had to happen. The major step was to get rid of the service module, and this was the first opportunity.
We copied that.
This was the first opportunity to actually see what state the service module was in.
We copied that report from Jim Lovell of service module separation at 138 hours, 2 minutes, 8 seconds.
And it's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? Right by the, look up there. Right by the high gate antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Copy that.
So these pictures were very useful in helping figure out what happened after the mission. But you know, it was a pure indication that something major had happened in the service module. And there is a photo of the service module going away and the moon in the distance. So they had to get rid of the lunar module. And one thing I should mention about the command module is it was very humid in the command module. And you may remember from Apollo 13 showing that when the astronauts get in the command module, it actually began to rain in the command module. All this water began to fall from behind the controls. And, you know, Kevin Bacon in the movie says, geez, I hope, you know, this doesn't short out when I turn it on. And it was only because of changes that had been made to the command module wiring after the Apollo 1 fire that all the wires were totally insulated and waterproof to prevent short circuits. So that saved the astronauts that day. So the lunar module was jettisoned. And the problem that they had, another problem, was that the command module didn't have any way to move away from the lunar module. They like to use little rockets to push the two spacecraft apart to ensure that they get far enough away and they don't recontact. And they couldn't do that for the command module. So one of the Grumman engineers knew Barry French, who I believe is right here, and he was one of the U of T aerospace study professors. And he called up Barry and said, look, we've got this issue. We want to know how much air to put in the docking tunnel in between the command and command module and the lunar module so that when we detach the two, the expanding air will give the lunar module enough push to move it away from the command module. The problem was too much air would have possibly pushed in a hatch and killed the crew, and too little air and the lunar module wouldn't have moved far enough away. So these guys thought, okay, we must be one of dozens of teams that are working on this. So they did some back of the envelope calculations, whatever, and called up the Grumman guy and said 2 pounds per square inch or something like that. And they said, great. And afterwards they found out that they were the only ones that had been asked. And so they had a critical part in the crew. And quickly read this, just something from Fred Hayes, which was thanking the University of Toronto Aerospace Studies team, providing a safe means to utilize pressure in the tunnel to provide safe separation without damaging the hat. And in fact, about 15 years ago, Fred came up to Toronto and had a meal with the crew just to thank. So that's Fred in the middle on the right, and I think that's Barry French at the back on the left. And Barry actually lives in Oakville now.
Houston, we'll punch off at 141 +30. Okay, Jack, we copy and we concur. Jack Schweigert indicating that they plan to jettison the lunar module in about 3 minutes from this time. Odyssey Houston, we can give you a go if you put the logic on momentarily, please. Okay, the 6 logic is on. Okay, just copied that, and you are go for fire alarm. Real fine. Okay, copy that. Very well, Aquarius. Thank you.
So it's a shame that Aquarius couldn't be in a museum somewhere, but unfortunately it's in the bits of it are in the bottom of the Pacific. So the landing was a normal landing, and the navigation was excellent, and the crew were recovered, and a great celebration in Mission Control. Gene Kranz with one of the obligatory cigars there. Afterwards, the crew visited various institutions, NASA centers, contractor sites. This is the Grumman site in Bethpage, Long Island. Hayes had actually spent just literally months when he became an astronaut at Grumman. And when we visited Grumman years ago, they told us that Fred would actually sleep in one of the LEMs that was being built just to get an idea of what it was like. So he was definitely destined to make a flight to the moon. And he ultimately left NASA and worked for Grumman for several years. So after the mission, of course, there was a lot of media coverage, magazines. George Skurla, who was a vice president for Grumman, he actually went down to Florida in the mid-60s to set up an office there for Grumman people to move down to Florida to work on the lunar modules when they were there. They'd be delivered down there. They'd be prepared to be put on the rocket and all that. They had 1,600 people. He had 1,600 people working under him. And he ultimately became president of Grumman. And when I visited him in his basement in his home in Long Island, he showed me the plaque that the astronauts had given him afterwards. And apparently, just as the astronauts were closing up the LEM, they just grabbed everything that wasn't nailed down. And there's all this netting that prevented the astronauts from sort of puncturing the thin walls or whatever. They just grabbed it all and brought it back and cut it up into little pieces and gave it to people who helped them get back. So this was a nice thing that he had. So why did the accident happen? There was a review board. They took several months to look at all aspects of the mission. And they feel that the accident happened because of what happened on that terminal countdown demonstration day. When the oxygen tanks in the service module were all filled up, they had problem detanking, getting the oxygen out of oxygen tank 2. And something was wrong with that tank. And they went back and they saw that it actually had been in the Apollo 10 tank service module. But when it was being placed, it had been dropped a few inches. And so it was pulled and replaced for another one. And it was checked out. It seemed to be fine, but actually it was damaged. And it was damaged to the fact that it could not be easily detanked when it was filled up during a TCDT. So they applied a current to the heater, but they applied the wrong current. The documentation wasn't set up properly. And they applied too much current to the heater such that it welded shut, thermostat welded shut. And here is the oxygen tank 2 in the service module. And here, when they tried it again, they actually proved that the thermostat welded shut. And essentially, after that time, the electronics that were used to run the fan system was essentially a bomb. There was also flammable material inside the tank that should, you know, was a bad decision. So at the point in time when they asked the crew to turn the fan on, a spark ignited that oxygen and the flammable material, and the tank blew up. They were able to reproduce this with a test service module. Here's a photograph of the oxygen tank blowing up, and here's a few photographs showing the panel of a service module actually blowing off during a test. So this would delay Apollo 14. They added another oxygen tank to the service module, and they made several changes to the system to prevent another accident like what happened on Apollo 13. Apollo 14 flew nearly 10 months after Apollo 13 and landed at Fromaro. So they landed at Home Crater. Around that time, the Apollo and NASA was, there were cutbacks due to the expensive war in Vietnam. So 2 missions, Apollo 19 and 20, were canceled. And ultimately a 3rd mission, Apollo 18, was canceled. So that left only 14, 15, 16, and 17. After Apollo 13, just a few years later, there was this movie made, Houston, We've Got a Problem. And I think it was on ABC. And I remember watching this turkey. And Robert Culp was in it. There were a lot of stars. But it was like just take an Apollo 13 movie and mix it with a soap opera. And that's what and NASA gave them the go-ahead to do it. They actually had flight controllers. Cy told me that he was in the movie. And it was just, but it turned out to be a real dud. And even Lovell didn't like it. But it is on YouTube if you really have to sit through it. Apollo 13, the movie by Ron Howard, came out in the mid-90s. One scene has Tom Hanks as Jim Lovell meeting the commander of the aircraft carrier, played by Jim Lovell. So he had a big part in that. And I found this picture, which is the real Jim Lovell with the real Navy commander. Some books have been written about the mission. The Apollo flight that failed by Henry Cooper came out, it was one of the first books that came out. And there have been some other books just on the missions itself and by people who were part of it, like Gene Kranz, Jim Lovell, and Cy Lieberman. There is a website that is out. It came out just before the mission, which is, you can actually sit through the entire mission. Maybe many of you remember when Ben Feist gave talks at our center. He gave a talk last year about the Apollo 11 movie that he was part of, and he told me he was working on this this Apollo 13 in real-time website, and it's amazing. It's just mind-blowing. So check it out if you're interested in sitting through all 150 some odd hours of the mission. There are some great websites like this Apollo 13 Flight Journal, which has a lot of, I actually did a lot of research. This was one of my go-tos for research for this talk. So where are they now? Well, Jack Swigert left NASA and actually ran to be a congressman in 1982 and won. Unfortunately, a month later, he died of cancer. So he only had one flight. And there's a big statue of him in the Denver airport. These two Capcoms, Capsule Communicators, Jack Lausma on the right and Vance Brand on the left, continue to be astronauts. Vance Brand flew on the Apollo Soyuz mission. There's Vance at a conference that I was at. And Jack Lausma flew on Skylab and flew on the 3rd Space Shuttle mission. So they did get their chance to fly. If Apollo 19 had flown, Jack Lausma probably would have flown the lunar module on that flight. And Vance Brand would have been the command module pilot for Apollo 18. Here's Joe Kerwin, I mean. And we met Joe down in Florida. There's, you might recognize that mug on the left, at a conference that Alan, Val, and Betty and I were down at, and Joe was there. Great guy, just a great meeting him and chatting with him. Cy, who really had trouble recovering from Apollo 13, just the stress of it all. He was at a conference I was at. He had actually been very sick the year before. So a lot of these, you know, these flight controllers, they were young, they were in their 20s, but man, they lived through so much stress doing all of what they did. I've met Fred a couple times, which made it possible to approach him and ask him to join us in April. This is at a conference where the fellow was beside me there with the white hair. He's from Hawaii, and we were just sitting having dinner one night, and Fred showed up and sat down, and we were there for a couple hours just yakking, and some other people from actually from a couple guys on the right are from Canada. We just started yakking. Just wouldn't think that he was who he was, and that's my only picture with Jim Lovell. Sort of somehow got into that picture. So what about Apollo 13? Well, there are several aspects about 13 that, you know, if you're superstitious, maybe you wouldn't have called it Apollo 13. I don't know if NASA's superstitious, but if you're wondering what the 13th space shuttle mission was called, it was called 41G. And that was the one that Mark Garneau was on. And I'm sorry I went over a little bit there, but thank you for listening, and I will unshare my screen. And losing my voice, but if anyone has any questions, they can unmute. Or am I making noise on my microphone? Was that? Oh, sorry. Oh no, I think we got the noise. If anyone has any questions, please unmute, and I would be glad to try to answer them.
Hi, Randy.
Hi.
My name is Beulah Paul. Fortunately, I couldn't get on the video. I just saw some shots and then listen.
Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Just audio, but it is so brilliant. You took it through it so nicely. And maybe one day you can present it live at a lecture.
Well, it actually is going to be, it was recorded, so I'll send the link out. Maybe you can watch it.
Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, there's always technical problems with Zoom.
Yes.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Otherwise, I can move on to
all right.
Some announcements.
Just want to say thank you. Thank you again. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Reread one book on Apollo 13. That would be Jim Lovell's book, I think.
All right.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions, chat-wise or otherwise? Okay, if not, let me make a few announcements here. Again, next Tuesday is our new members welcome, and we'll send some links out to that. Everyone is welcome to that. The potpourri on July 24th, we're looking for some short talks. So if you have a 10, 15-minute talk that you'd like to give, you know, some astrophotos, what you've been doing on your COVID-19 quarantine, whatever, that'd be great. So please let us know. Send me an email. Don't forget that there's still national programs going on. So go to the rasc.ca site for that. Go to the COVID-19 site. And I think they have a lecture tomorrow night. And we just have a whole bunch of programming going on as well, including the Explore the Universe certificate. We are updating the website. And within a week, I think the website will be updated. So look for that. Thanks again to Rob Neal for help there, and Alan Connery.
Yeah, I'll be ready.
Yeah, we're getting there. The comet.
The comet.
Who wants to describe a little bit on how we can see the comet?
I think Chris does. Come on, Chris.
Have to unmute Chris.
Well, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's going to move into the evening sky. I mean, Ryan, you stated that on Monday it'll be 6 degrees above the horizon in the western sky. So if people want to get up at 4:30 in the morning, and it's probably going to be cloudy tomorrow morning, why not wait till next week? And I think by Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it'll be in a very, very convenient, like 10 p.m. look to the northwest. it'll be under the Big Dipper. Like the Big Dipper will be at an angle, so it's about a dipper or so down to the right of it. That's where it'll be. Binoculars will help. We hope it'll be a nice naked eye thing. You'll need a nice horizon to the northwest. So I mean, I've already been walking around my neighborhood looking at the horizons where there's lights, and I actually know there's I can walk 1 block away from my house, and I know I'm going to have a good sight line because I saw the Big Dipper there and where it's going to be, so I know where I'm going to observe it from next week. So that's going to be a really exciting time, not having to get up early in the morning.
What's the name of the comet?
Neowise, Neowise. It's the brightest. It's one of the best comets in the last 13 years. It's naked eye, and it's got a naked eye tail, which is really cool. Like often to see a tail, you need binoculars, but here, naked eye, even from the city, you can see a tail.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, go for it. It's something special right now.
Can you see that star chart now?
Yeah, so look at the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper is really easy to see, and you just go down in that direction. That's where it'll be. So find the Big Dipper one of these evenings and figure out where will that bit of sky be visible for me. Like go out at 10 p.m. and find that thing so you're prepared for to look in that area.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is July 17th at 10:30. So that's northwest, and the Big Dipper will be a great way to align yourself.
I'd look earlier. It's nice and dark at 10 p.m. By 10:15, it's considerably dark. So don't wait as late as 10:30. It'll be low. So I'm going to try finding it at 9:50. It'll still be quite bright, but you can already see the Big Dipper at 9:45. I looked for it yesterday. So 15 minutes later, look for the comet when it's still high up enough.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
Wonderful.
Sure.
Any other announcements, folks? Okay. Well, thanks for. Sorry, I went a little bit late there, but once I get into this, I can't stop talking. So we'll try to continue to do this. So if anyone has a topic that they would like to present for our August meeting, please let me know. And with that, wish everyone clear skies, stay safe, and we'll see you Tuesday for the new member welcome, and 2 weeks tonight for the potpourri.
Yeah.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Yeah. Good night.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Bye.
Bye, John Boy.
Thank you, Randy.
You're welcome. Thanks. We'll see who the last person is.
Well, it has to be you.
Oh.
That's right.
All right.
I give up. Bye.
Bye, John.
There's Terry and Joseph and Eclose, Mary Lou.
It's funny. A fellow named Ennio, you mentioned him at the beginning.
Yeah.
He was the one that asked. I don't know whether you saw it, but there was an email asking if he could come on.
Yeah, I actually replied to him too, so we got two.
Oh, okay. But the funny thing is, I just said his name out because it was similar to Ennio Morricone, who just died, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And Val said, "Wait, ask him if he's Ennio from IBM who worked on kiosk systems." And sure enough, it was.
No way.
And he just retired from. She knew him from working on kiosk systems.
Did you just chat with him?
Well, I emailed him back, and he said, "Yeah, I was." I said, "Well, Val says hi."
Oh, that's too cool.
That's pretty weird.
That is wild.
Because it's an unusual name,
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, don't you people have something better to do?
Yeah. Okay.
No, we don't.
I have the rest of my bottle to get to.
I'd love to talk to you, Sheila. If you want. How are you, Sheila?
I'm okay. I got a haircut. Yay.
And you survived the storm.
Yeah, wow, we got a humdinger. Wendy was saying they got thunder and lightning, but the rain never arrived in Oakville. But here, it just slammed into Burlington.
Oh, really?
Now it's clearing up.
That's wild.
You didn't get it in Mississauga, Randy?
I didn't hear it. I don't.
Okay, well,
can't
are
see
you
it.
downstairs? You're downstairs.
Yeah, I'm in the dungeon.
Yeah. So.
But I'm just going to look up a handy weather map. Well, it looks like some missed us, but some might be heading our way actually.
Well, it looks like all week.
Yeah, there's some heading our way. It's just going through Hamilton now, so in another
great.
bit, in a few minutes.
Okay. Well, I hope that's the end for here because it was enough rain.
Wow.
Well, we needed rain though. Come
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, the grass was starting to turn brown and yeah. Plus it shows the heat's gone down. We're going down into the 20s for quite a few
great.
days, it says now.
on. Oh, turn the heat on.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry I went so late there.
You didn't go late.
Ah, no, it's fine.
Our
okay.
meeting is 10 o'clock, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my
Well,
trip home is a lot faster.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, but there's no pub. I'm missing the pub.
Yeah. That's too
Wendy has us on a pub Zoom.
bad. You're kidding.
You
There's a new Zoom that you're going to now?
Well, no, Wendy does it on, I don't know, Thursdays or something. And it's just like the people, some of the people went to the pub, right? So we just sit around and bemoan our fate.
Aw.
But it's
Well,
nice to see everybody.
I'm going to go now so that I get some more of this before Val gets to
Your
it.
glass,
Yeah.
your glass is empty.
Damn right.
All
right.
right.
All right, guys. Have a
nice
good
to see
weekend.
everybody.
See everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.